In photographs and newsreels distributed by the Japanese government, the final toast of the pilots, known as Kamikaze, appears as a moment of absolute serenity. Young officers raise their cups, wear rising sun headbands tied around their foreheads, and are presented as cherry blossom petals falling for the nation. The pilot who tied that headband at dawn, however, was often the same man who, only a few hours earlier, had shattered a light bulb in despair, cried in his mother's arms, or shouted the name of his girlfriend. In this video, the first in a series about the Kamikaze experience, we will focus on the last night of these young officers. Not on the impact, not on the death, but on the hours immediately preceding the final flight. To do so, we will draw on letters, diaries, memoirs, and base-level testimonies, as well as the historiography produced after the war. The goal is not to explain military strategy or reproduce heroic imagery, but to closely examine what propaganda worked to conceal. If you know this history only through official images, it may be worth staying until the end. The propaganda surrounding the special attack units, historically known as the Tokotai, was not designed merely to boost wartime morale. It served a more delicate and far-reaching purpose: to transform the imminent death of thousands of young men into something visually acceptable, symbolically desirable, and socially unquestionable. To achieve this, the Japanese state relied on a carefully curated aesthetic language, capable of converting extreme violence into familiar cultural imagery. At the center of this operation was the cherry blossom. The sakura, a traditional symbol of beauty and impermanence, was gradually displaced from its poetic context and appropriated as an official metaphor for death in combat. Propaganda insisted that the ideal soldier should fall like a petal at his peak, unattached to life, beautiful at the moment of destruction. An old Buddhist term, Sangye, originally referring to the ritual scattering of petals in praise of the Buddha, was stripped of its religious meaning and repurposed as a euphemism for dying for the nation. This was not merely an attempt to decorate death, but to reframe it as an aesthetic experience, neutralizing any attempt to perceive it as brutal or unjustifiable. This aestheticization did not operate only at the symbolic level. It produced a concrete psychological effect. By associating sacrifice with beauty, the state created an equation in which refusing death also meant refusing dignity. Military aggression ceased to appear horrific. It became sublimation. Many pilots, in their private diaries, referred to this process as state-sponsored murder. That vocabulary, however, never appeared in public. In public, there were only petals. At the same time, propaganda had to sustain the fiction of voluntarism. Newsreels and photographs showed young officers serenely toasting the emperor, wearing rising sun headbands, smiling with a carefully rehearsed calm before takeoff. This was tatame, the public facade of the decision. The private reality, hone, remained outside the frame. Base-level testimonies reveal that, far from the cameras, the scene was entirely different. Officers drank chilled sake to numb their fear, shouted the names of their mothers or girlfriends, not the emperor, and spent their final hours in a state of tension that propaganda could not admit without collapsing its own narrative. Maintaining this performance required more than images. It required total systemic coherence. The pilot was treated as ammunition. Once launched, he was not meant to return. If an aircraft came back due to mechanical failure or an inability to locate the target, there was no relief or reassurance, only contempt. There are documented cases of pilots executed for cowardice after multiple aborted takeoffs caused by technical failures. Such episodes were never incorporated into propaganda because they exposed the central flaw of the heroic narrative. The system could not tolerate the failure of death itself. This logic did not begin at the airbase. It was taught long before. From primary school onward, textbooks visually associated cherry blossoms, rising sun flags, toy soldiers, and warships in a single symbolic sequence. Popular songs repeated that friends were petals destined to fall together, and that reunion would take place at Yasukuni Shrine. War was presented not as a rupture of life, but as its natural conclusion. By the time these young men arrived at the air bases, they were already surrounded by symbols familiar since childhood. To complete the circuit, the state offered a promise of apotheosis. In a religious context that lacked a clear concept of an afterlife, propaganda assured that pilots who died in special missions would become war gods, enshrined at Yasukuni and honored by the emperor himself. The absence of bodies, replaced by empty, white boxes or small biological mementos such as hair or fingernails, was compensated by the promise of state-sanctioned immortality. Private grief was redirected into national worship. This machinery functioned only because it sealed off the possibility of return. Once the hero's mask was publicly worn, in the toast, the photograph, the smile captured by the newsreel, social pressure and solidarity with the dead made refusal morally unthinkable. Not because these young men were fanatics, but because the system was designed to offer no lateral exits. The last night bore little resemblance to the images that would circulate the following day. Before the toast, before the photograph, before the rising sun headband, there were hours that did not interest the state and therefore were not recorded. What we know about this interval comes from accounts that escaped the logic of propaganda. One of the most important is that of Kasuga Takeo, a conscripted soldier who worked in maintenance and in the mess halls of the Tsuchiura Naval Air Base, from which many Tokotai flights departed. His role placed him in a singular position, close enough to see everything, invisible enough to go unnoticed. It was there, when the cameras were turned off, that the soldier's mask began to crack. Kasuga describes the farewell gatherings not as solemn ceremonies, but as scenes of absolute despair and psychological disintegration. Young officers drank large quantities of chilled sake, not as ritual, but as an attempt to numb the terror of imminent annihilation. Accumulated tension exploded into violence against the surroundings. Swords used to smash light bulbs, chairs hurled at windows, tablecloths torn apart amid military songs interrupted by curses. At the height of intoxication and fear, official language vanished. Kasuga notes that they abandoned bonsai and began shouting, heads in their hands, the names of their mothers and girlfriends. Some wept silently, others danced in frenzied motion, smashing flower vases as if they needed to destroy something tangible before being destroyed themselves. None of this appeared in official records. But this was not the only form the last night took. Before reaching the base, for many pilots, the breaking point began at home. Sources show that domestic farewells were rarely filled with patriotic speeches. What appears most often is silence. In the case of Sasaki Hachirō, his final night at home was marked by his father's refusal, a prosperous merchant, to accept his son's final flight. Unable to validate a sacrifice, he considered pointless. He refused a formal farewell and left the house, leaving the goodbye suspended in a void of unspoken words. That silence was not an absence of feeling. It was a refusal to give shape or language to a sacrifice he could not accept. Others tried to prolong, for a few hours, what still seemed intact. Matsunaga Tatsuki, married only 2 months earlier, described his final night beside his wife as a quiet and beautiful happiness. He wrote about watching her sleep, about preserving physical closeness as a last safe territory, while trying to reconcile that intimacy with the conviction that he must die as an officer. In his words, intellectual life appeared on the verge of interruption, an indirect way of naming what would have no continuation. Hayashi Ichitsu, a devout Christian, spent his final hours reading the Bible and The Concept of Anxiety by Kierkegaard. On the eve of the attack, he and several friends went to a nearby school to sing hymns, accompanied by an organ, a risky act under military surveillance. but one that served as a final affirmation of humanity. Ichijima Yasuo, in turn, sought an almost sensory calm. He washed his face in a stream, picked simple flowers, and allowed himself to drift into memories of childhood and family walks. He described a strange tranquility, sustained by minimal sounds and by an effort to remain anchored in elemental experiences. At dawn, however, the mask had to be rebuilt. Maintenance crews decorated the aircraft with cherry blossoms, headbands were tied. Before takeoff came the formal toast, the kanpai. When the sun rose and the cameras were turned on, the night had already passed. What remained of it, the alcohol, the crying, the domestic silence, the mothers' names, did not fit the image of the hero, and so remained outside the frame,